on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
There was an awful lot of opportunity to do something for these tuna and billfish visiting the Hawaiian Islands. I learned very quickly that the fishermen were where it's at as far as the knowledge.
Some fish are eaten out there that it's not like a culture to eat in many places. They eat bonefish out there.
The Hawaiians, they had it together early on, and the chiefs regulated the time that certain species could be fished, and they avoided the spawning periods, and so they had their own natural management systems that are still practiced in some of the conservation areas.
They're catching these fish in the wild and then rearing them in captivity. I don't like it. Where is it heading?
We wouldn't have a U.S. fishery if these fish weren't being fished sustainably. It just wouldn't happen, no matter what anyone else tells you.
Wait a second. What the heck's going on here? We need to be eating our seafood here at home.
Frozen is the new fresh. It's not always about fresh local. It can be frozen local, too. Get to know your fishermen. Where did your fish come from?
Episode 149 of the WildFed podcast, Boat to Table, Know Your Fisherman with Molly Lutcavage, is brought to you by Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Surthrival.com is your source for nature-based supplements that keep you thriving in our modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Surthrival keeps you thriving when others are merely surviving. Check out their Pine Pollen Pure Potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capacity, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you heard about during the pandemic. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Hunting season is right around the corner. If you dream of being able to successfully and sustainably harvest food from the land, this might be your perfect next step. Learning to hunt can be overwhelming, especially without a mentor. From finding land to hunt on, to developing the skills, to learning to process your harvest and finding people with shared values you can hunt with. The Hunter's Journey is a thriving online course and community with mentors ready to guide you from where you are now to becoming a successful hunter. Their team believes in stewardship of the land, reverence for the species that they hunt, and respect for all people. Many of their students got out on their first successful hunts last season utilizing what they'd learned through the Hunter's Journey. And remember, even if you're not quite ready to harvest an animal yourself, you can apply these same skills to shooting with your camera. The Hunter's Journey has a special offer just for WildFed listeners. Visit thehuntersjourney.com and enter the coupon code WildFed100 to get $100 off the course. Again, that's thehuntersjourney.com and the coupon code is WildFed100. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. We're back today with my good friend Molly Lutcavage, oceanographer, bluefin tuna and sea turtle physiologist, and the director of large pelagic research at the University of Massachusetts. Her last appearance on the show was back on episode 16 of this podcast, The Truth About Bluefin Tuna, making her one of our earliest podcast guests. She was also featured in season 2 of the WildFed TV show on Outdoor Channel in our Atlantic Bluefin Tuna episode. Her groundbreaking work on Atlantic bluefins has revealed that, contrary to what most of us have been taught, the Atlantic bluefin tuna population is strong and the fishery has been rebuilt. That work led me to harvest my first bluefin last year and to feel really good about eating locally sourced bluefin from here in the Gulf of Maine, a fish that I had avoided because I believed the fishery was being overexploited. Well, I'm glad I learned otherwise, because participating in that fishery was an incredible experience, and I'm still eating the tuna we caught last year. In fact, I served some last weekend as poke to our guests that we had in town. Bluefin as a food, even when it's been in the freezer for almost a year like mine, is one of the most incredible delicacies available to us in the wild world. But Molly doesn't just work in the Gloucester fishery here in the Gulf of Maine. She winters on the island of Kauai in Hawaii, where she's involved in marine research efforts there too. She recently returned home to the Northeast for the summer, and I had been in Hawaii recently too, so I thought it'd be great to get back together and discuss not just the bluefin and sea turtles she works with, but also about her work in Hawaii and about closing the loop between fishermen and the consumer. You probably already know, but Americans are exporting far more of our fish than we are eating. And up until recently, it's been a lot harder for the public to access fresh fish from the fleet than it has been for us to connect with, say, our local farmers. Of course, we can get local fish, but it's often passed through several middlemen first. But Molly and others are developing models that help to close that loop and bring the consumer and the fisherman closer together. She also believes in utilizing more of our catch and continues to combat the myth of methylmercury toxicity from large pelagics like tunas. All in all, Molly is a living legend, specializing where the worlds of marine biology and fisheries intersect. She's had an incredible career at sea, and her insights are invaluable to me and many others, so it's always a pleasure to sit down with her for another great conversation.
Molly Lutcavage, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Daniel. Great to see you all.
Good to see you. Thanks for meeting us in this fine library here. It's the first time I've been in a library in a long time.
Ever.
Used to live in them. I used to really live in them, but yeah, I haven't been in one.
We walked in today and I was like, the smell of a library.
Smell of books.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for coming up here, meeting us halfway. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So this is your second time on the podcast, and you've also done the TV show with us last season, season 2. So great to be back here with you. And you've just coming back from Hawaii?
I am coming back from Kauai.
Yeah. I really love to hear about what you spend your time doing out there, especially I think now, because we talked a little bit about it in the past, but Grant and I haven't just got back from Hawaii ourselves. I feel like I was watching Moana the other day. That's where I'm at. I'm just interested in all things Hawaii right now, even Disney films. So I mean, I'm super curious about your world out there, because you've been wintering there how long?
Oh, wintering and more probably since 2010.
Oh, cool.
2010, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing place, as you know. It lures you back. It's just such a big ocean, and the mix of cultures there, and just the incredible beauty it's just compelling. It just drew me in. I had wished I'd gone sooner in life, because probably undertake a lot more adventurous things than I am doing now.
There's I don't know how you would explain it scientifically, but there's like a sense of the livingness of the place that I relate to the geological activity there, and the active volcano, and the sense of contrasted against the Northeast here where we are now, with its really ancient geology and all this compression, and the gemstones here in our rounded off mountains. This is just such an old and stable place, and then you go there and it's like it's still coming up out of the sea.
Absolutely.
It's so alive,
It is, and it takes years. I mean, if you just visit the islands, you're just, you think it's a tourist destination, and, hula and the food and poke. But the longer you spend, the more you realize, oh my goodness, you just have to dig so deep to understand the history, and just, in addition to the geological history, just the waves, like who got there first and what happened next, and then the mix of all the cultures that are there now is just compelling. And trying to fit in and do something worthwhile that you're contributing to the Hawaiians, for me, was a big important thing. So to do something with fisheries was the reason why I felt comfortable being there. I think to just be there and not contribute would be tough.
I'm like a little embarrassed about having gone there around age 20. I think it was 19. Just now having been there and had a more culturally immersive experience. And I'm like a little embarrassed about the attitude that I brought there, especially because I know it's representative of a cultural attitude that I brought with me, because I didn't understand who the Hawaiian people were, what the history was, the things that had happened there. I just showed up there like, this is like America's backyard. We get to go use this place for fun. And like, I just didn't really even take the time, because I didn't know any different. I didn't know to take the time.
Most people don't. We certainly didn't.
Well, that's the thing that's hard to see, right? It's like you see that. So you see the family, and they're like the ABC Aloha shirts, right? And the leis, and they're doing all the tourist stuff, and
the TV shows. Let's not forget those.
There was a lot of suspicion about what we wanted to make a show about. I can say that. It took a little time for us to, people really wanted to get to know us before they were willing to participate, and you just felt like they had been burned over and over and over again by TV and media, and so But anyway. It was really neat to get a sense of the history of the place. And like you said, who came first? I've been reading about the Polynesians who were there before the kind of beginning of the sort of modern Hawaiian history, right? The folks who came from, I want to say Tahiti, that sort of begin what we think of as Hawaiian history, but not much known about the folks before. But, this is a place where people from Polynesia were going.
It's amazing. And, there's still, I'm certainly not an authority on anything, but like you, when you delve into it, because there's just so much to try to understand. And I think the most fascinating thing is even the first, before the Tahitians or Tahitian area, there's some belief that the southeastern China and the islands off southeast China could have been the original people that started voyaging into the Pacific. And that's just so wild to think about that whole chain.
When we really started, one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was looking at Google Earth and looking at how many islands and atolls are actually out there, because I always imagined Hawaii to be super isolated out in the middle of the Pacific, and now I see actually there's quite a chain of islands, and it starts to make more sense how people could have been traveling from island to island and perceived through, swells and through birds and through, many different means, reflectivity off of clouds, or all these different navigational tools that they had, that there was islands that they could travel to. So it's more conceivable to me now, because it used to be like, I couldn't understand it. You know?
But then when you see the local skill on the water with the the voyaging canoes and stuff, you surfing everything, you think, oh, I get it.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
They're really good at what they do.
I was also taken by the idea, because there's been a thing here on this podcast, we've explored a lot about what is an indigenous species versus a non-native species, and looking at invasives and introductions and all of this deleterious non-natives and stuff. But this was the first time I was seeing what was called native plants were actually the plants that were brought by people. So we would see a native plant, a native planting, but these were the canoe plants, as they call them. These 24 species that were brought to Hawaii are considered native plants, but they're not actually from those islands, so that was interesting too, like breadfruit, for instance, or kava, or many of the different food plants and medicine plants that were brought there. So that was really fascinating to me too, the idea of voyagers traveling with these plants as well as pigs and chickens and dogs. It's fascinating to me, on canoes.
On canoes,
so cool.
Big canoes.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about what you do out there for work. I'm very curious to hear about it.
Well, I would say that my best knowledge of from our perspective is the fishery and fish and fishermen. And I've been lucky enough to have been introduced to many fishermen on not just Kauai, but some of the islands through my friends and colleagues that are in the Pacific Islands Fisheries Group. And they publish, speaking of culture, La Vaya magazine, which tries to keep the culture of shore-based fishing as well as ocean-going fishing alive. And so I met my colleagues, Clay Tam, at Fisheries management meeting for the Western and Central Pacific. And I was brought in sort of as the outside large pelagic expert who had experience in the Atlantic and on bluefin and on big eye and some other species, but was sort of the ecologist that came from elsewhere. But by participating in that fisheries management and science discussion, I got to know people. And so it was that entree into it that, doing something productive, getting to meet not just the fishery scientists and the economists that showed up to do the work, but the fishermen that came to the meetings and that were from different islands. So I got to know one guy from Maui, and the top, the people that were representing their best interests would come to the meetings. And so you get to talk story with them. Talk story, as you know, means sit down and talk together, share knowledge. And so that's how I sort of got my introduction into working with the community of fishermen. And I think if it weren't for that, it would be really hard to feel comfortable just going there to vacation and do nothing else. So there was an awful lot of opportunity to do something productive in the science area for these large big fish, tuna and billfish. And I saw that as, we can work together to learn more about the fish that are visiting the Hawaiian Islands.
And your background is working, at least in the Atlantic side, was working bluefin, but also sea turtles, right? Part of your background as well. But if I understand just from the conversations we've had, something else that characterizes your career is that you work very closely with the people in the fisheries, not just from like the remote policy side or something. Like you've been on fishing boats and you've spent your career working alongside the fishing community, right? So you sort of took that approach.
Absolutely.
Going out there.
Yeah, cooperative research, but from early days in grad school, I learned very quickly that the fishermen were where it's at as far as the knowledge.
Yeah,
and so that made it, it was just the way we do our work. So on Kawaii, as you might imagine, you've been there, and the idea of trust is not easily obtained in any fishery application. So, but I had the entree already with the PhD group. They're known as well for many years of working side by side with fishermen to help understand, particular species, bottom fish, for example. So there was a great deal of trust. So if you're working with these guys that are trusted, it was okay. You get okay. So she's a Halle girl from the East Coast, but she's okay.
Really different fishery, right? Because one of the things that I found most stunning about the place was getting out my Navionics app and just looking at the depths as soon as you go off the coast. And even, how it is like sort of from so many places you can see the ocean. So you can see that place before the reef where it's like kind of turquoise water, and then you see that dark blue right off of that reef. And you look at the depths and you're like, oh, this is in the thousands of fathoms. Like,
absolutely.
How can it be?
It's crazy.
How can it be so deep, right? Between, I think it was Maui and Oahu between them, whereas some of the depths were like pretty stunning. So anyway, very different than our fishery here with all of these banks, these shallow banks that we have, right? So I'm assuming that you have your reef fish there, and then you must have just this drop-off that's just traveling pelagics. Like, what's going on? How is it different than here?
Oh, you're so right. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, the abysmal depths are mind-blowing. I mean, you're looking at the sounder and you're saying, is that in fathoms?
Is that right?
What is that? No,
How far is 1 fathom?
6 feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're in thousands of fathoms.
Because if we go out like 40 miles up the coast of Maine,
we're in 300 to 400 feet of water.
Right. Yeah.
At least when we're going to the banks to fish. When we're ground fishing, we're 200 to 400. Let's say 400 is like deep for us to fish.
Yeah.
That's the deepest. I think the Gulf of Maine is what, 3, I forget. It's under 400. Or around
really?
there. Yeah. It's a shallow.
Yeah.
Compared to out there, it's the ocean. It's the deep, but yeah, the large pelagics, like the tunas and the billfish, there's two really cool things about them. One, they come in. We know from tagging yellowfin tuna that we've been doing, and more recently striped marlin, some big eye, but they appear to come in at different times of the year, and that's good because, of course, everyone likes the tuna there. It's the most important species in their diet, and particularly for holidays and special occasions or birthdays, the most of the locals provide that for the guests. So over the holidays and New Year's Eve in particular, New Year's, you must have tuna and poke and sashimi and sushi. So fishermen that fish for the large pelagics, they know these patterns when the fish are likely to be there. And what I always wonder is, how do they find these fish? As you say, as we know now from putting tags out, they're swimming by, but they, like fish here, they like to come and feed where there's lots of concentration of food. And so at certain times of year, I guess the currents are right and the fish come close to the islands. And so they're feeding. But the second cool thing is these yellowfin, swordfish, marlins, blue marlin, striped marlin, they're coming in and they are spawning close to the islands that appear to give some benefit for development of larvae without being eaten by everything. So you could literally take a small boat or a skiff, and if we towed a plankton tow, you would find during the summer months.
A plankton tow is a fine mesh
like
net
a little bongo, or even you could do it. I mean, kids could do it. That's what we think would be a cool project for kids. You see these lines of color right off the island, not far at all. And there's stuff aggregated there. And, there's little bits of flotsam and jetsam and algae. But in there, you might find very small swordfish, billfish, and yellowfin larvae.
Does a larva of a swordfish or of a billfish still have the bill and everything? Are they miniature?
They're just getting them, and we literally. I mean, what's really cool is once we were tagging yellowfin. And, of course, we work with commercial fishermen, so they're out there not just harvesting. We tag the fish that are in good shape, but they're harvesting. So we get to see, for the fish that are harvested, we get to see what they're eating, guts and gonads. Of course, we always look. Mm-hmm. And one of the yellowfin tuna, it was probably about 80-pounder. When we looked in the stomach, there was, I would say, 5-inch baby swordfish. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. I mean, in addition to little puffer fish and other things that they're eating, little squids, little nautili, what do you call this? Shellless nautili. They're mollusks without shells.
Yeah,
they're beautiful.
The nautilus shell, yeah.
Paper nautili.
Okay.
Were in the belly, but with a little swordfish.
Wow.
Which I still have.
It's a swordfish in you do in miniature? Then?
It's actually in my neighbor's freezer because I unplugged the freezer, and so my friend Mimi is keeping it in her freezer.
Holding on to it for you.
I couldn't do anything with it. It was too beautiful.
But
yeah, so it's a larval habitat for not just the reef fish, but I guess that it offers protection from the big predators because everything's going to eat them. But and not a lot of work has been done. So.
Really?
Some work done in the 90s, and not much at all. So it's waiting. I just thought, this would be so cool for kids.
Wow, I'm surprised to hear that because so many people say, I want to be a marine biologist. And then you'd think a lot of them want to go to Hawaii to work. And you'd think this is something that'd be just people clamoring to work on.
Well, they do. There's a lot of great work, and a lot of schools are involved, and community colleges in coral reef habitat and nearshore fishes, and that's all really important. But I mean, one of the reasons we're out there trying to fill in gaps is there's just been not a lot of attention paid, probably since the 90s, to these big fish, including their larval habitats.
Okay.
And it's just waiting to be done, I think.
It's amazing because imagine with billfish in particular, the folks who are interested in billfish are high-rolling folks, right?
Yes.
These tournaments are big money, expensive boats, extremely wealthy people. So you'd think there'd be a lot of money around all of this, So that's why I would.
There is, but it's just that it's funny. It's like any other field. It's just who has the interest.
Sure.
And George Bollert, who actually was at Virginia Institute of Marine Science when I was a grad student, Bollert was the scientist who was the lead on the larval work done on the tunas and what's off the island, mainly off the Big Island. He's gone now, but there's been very little work of the islands and the billfish and the tunas since his work. National Marine Fisheries will do offshore, ocean-going research cruises out in the high seas, and they're certainly out there too. But the nearshore work, I think, is a frontier that we would love to tap. But it should be done with locals, with the students, because it's accessible to them. So you don't have to have a big research vessel.
Right. We ate marlin out there at a poke place. That was the first time I'd ever had it.
That was that first night? Yeah.
Oh, sushi?
In Waikiki.
Sashimi?
In poke, yes, sashimi style. And it was like, that was what was fresh. I mean, they were advertising it as what was fresh. And something that struck me out there was some fish are eaten out there that aren't really culture. That's not like a culture to eat in many places. So I know marlin was eaten in the past, but like something today is mostly people don't eat, right? Outside of Hawaii and many places anyway. And then they eat bonefish out there too in the flats, which is like another one that just almost nowhere you go, people eat. And it seemed like kind of like people eat whatever they catch out there. And I thought that was neat because things have changed so much. And that's not to, I got nothing bad to say about the catch and release fisheries, really. I think in some cases that's fantastic. Other cases, I don't know, mortality seems high. I'm not really sure. But I just thought that was a neat aspect of the culture out there, that they're considered food fish too. And
they know, as you know from your stay in Molokai, that they're the seasons of the first, the Hawaiians and the chiefs regulated the time that certain species could be fished, and they avoided the spawning periods, and so they had their own natural management systems that are still practiced in some of the conservation areas. So they had it together early on with conservation approaches.
And those fish ponds, what a fascinating idea. Like, if I understood it correctly, and we saw some, we didn't actually get to go spend any time at one, but we did see them from the air and sort of driving along the highway, and it looked like they had basically created like a weir and then allowed juvenile fish to get in there, but they grow too big to get back out, and then you can just fish in your pond. It's salt water. It's just an extension of the sea there, but that is a really brilliant way to keep access to fish all the time. It's really
Absolutely.
Really cool.
You need to visit the fish ponds. They're really they're being restored.
Okay.
Their value has really been recognized in the important role they played, but there's a fantastic, among the many fish ponds in the Hawaiian Islands, I know the ones on Kauai the best, and not far from Lahui, when you would fly in, there's an incredibly beautiful, I mean, it's my screensaver, actually, that's being restored, has been restored. They cut the mangroves out, invasive species.
So it's an original fish pond.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then there's another that new friends of mine, what's it called? They are, the fish pond has been in the family. It's on the south side of Kauai, and they are, they've restored the fish pond. It's so beautiful, and they have things like mullet, barracuda, young barracuda, and then, but they're also to not just augment the fish that are in the fish pond, and they have limu, as you know, the algae that's been growing just alongside the fish pond. They've discovered that limu in particular is fantastic flavor. It's sea lettuce, but it has a terrific crunch and flavor. I tasted, said, "Oh my God, how did I not know this was?" But they also are raising mollusks and sea cucumber and others
In the ponds?
outside.
Just
So
on the
they're
outside,
so culture, but hoping to diversify locally grown, not just the natural, the fish that are in the pond itself, but to augment local food security by do this. Really cool people.
That's cool. Wow. I've never got to harvest the sea cucumber. We saw some there. I've been really wanting to. We did harvest limpets out there and urchins. There's a purple urchin. I don't know if you've seen this thing, but oof, that was good. That uni in there.
Oh, the uni. And what about you? The limpets are OPE.
OPE, and we mostly ate them raw. And a lot of them we ate right there on the rocks,
wow.
And that was fantastic.
That's
really liked them.
very important for ceremonies, the OPE, to offer at important events.
Oh, okay, yeah, they seem to take it pretty seriously.
Oh,
yeah. Fantastic food, though. My goodness.
It's amazing, the appreciation of food there. But we've talked about this before with bluefin. I mean, just using every part of the fish, the tuna, the marlins. And you asked the question about marlins. Striped marlin is prized for raw, for ceviche and sashimi. That's what, if you really want to have sashimi, striped marlin, which we don't have so much of. And what's interesting about striped marlin, it's not a targeted catch, say on the high seas. So longliners that are going after tuna and sword, it's a incidental catch, and it can many of them are released. And of course, we just recently finished a big study of striped marlin. The survivorship is quite high, actually, if released properly.
Oh, good. Yeah.
But the marlins, like the tunas, if you remember the story we said about tagging yellowfin, ahi, striped marlin, they're all going far, even though they may spawn close to the islands, they may be there at certain times of years, but now we know from the satellite tagging that striped marlin, for example, that aren't that big, they're not the big blue marlin or the big, black marlins, but even they can travel across the Pacific.
Really?
Yeah, and one of our most spectacular result for that striped marlin, that's the ceviche fish, was tagged, I would say, off the Big Island, a bit south by a longliner partner who did most of our tagging. And a year later, its tag came off about 200 miles off Brisbane, Australia.
Whoa.
Wow.
And so that was the first data, direct data from a satellite tag that connected the main Hawaiian Islands area, striped marlin, to what was thought was to be a completely unrelated subgroup of striped marlin in the Southwest Pacific. And so these, our studies were able to show the connectivity of striped marlin from the main Hawaiian Islands with different parts of the Pacific. And that wasn't known before. And so they were managed in under separate management jurisdictions. And the main takeaway for managers from our work, which was just recently published, 2 papers, was, whoa, wait a minute, we better look at this together.
Yeah.
Because these fish are crossing boundaries, just like the ahi, the yellowfin.
Something I want to make sure we come back to. I don't know that I want to ask just yet, but I do want to ask about the big picture future for fisheries, because as we learn more and more about this connectivity, it means that we're not just these isolated nation states managing our fisheries, but that there's, very disparate nations might actually share a fishery. That's just really fascinating. But I wanted to ask you one other thing, and then I'd like to get into the striped marlin, because I don't know much about them. One of the days we were out, it was the new moon, so there was quite a low tide, and we were crabbing along the shoreline, and I found a sea turtle skull, and then I found the rest of the sea turtle, and I thought, like, oh, this is really weird. What's it doing here in the mangroves? And then the impression I got, though nobody really wanted to say too much, is like, yeah, people eat them, and they probably discarded it here, and I was just curious about that, if the culture of eating sea turtles, if you're familiar with any of that, because it seems like that's still going on, but it's amongst locals, but it's kind of hush-hush. That was my impression.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot to back that up, but that was sort of how I was led to believe.
Well, 2 things. I will say that if there was, it's possible that there was local harvest. It's not, officially it's not legal, although there's efforts to, let's say, local Native Hawaiians have requested that they have special consideration, not just Native Hawaiians, but Samoans and others. And I'm very familiar with it because I paid attention over all the decades. And sea turtles have been rebuilt, particularly the green turtle had been eaten. That's, the food turtle.
Oh, interesting.
And they are rebuilt. And in fact, if you spend enough time, you'll see them on the beaches with the tourists and the monk seals. And so they have been rebuilt. And so there's an argument by some, including some sea turtle ecologists, myself included, that a limited native take for cultural and food purposes should be allowed.
We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, one of our favorite episodes of WildFed Season 1 is now free on YouTube, hosted by My Outdoor TV International. The video name is WildFed Free Preview, but you can also see it on our website, wild-fed.com. It's an episode about harvesting wild rice and hunting black bears, and features a meal with Evan Hennessy, one of New Hampshire's most celebrated chefs. If access to cables kept you from seeing the WildFed TV show, this is a great way to get a taste of the series. The rest of Season 1 is available through Outdoor Channel's streaming service, My Outdoor TV, and Season 2 should be hosted there soon too. Currently, we're busy shooting and producing our 3rd season, and I can hardly wait for you to see it. It'll be debuting this winter right around the new year. In the meantime, head over to YouTube or wild-fed.com to see a full 22-minute episode. Now, back to the show.
It's controversial, and it's still not, I don't think it's gotten to the acceptance place, because you're up against Endangered Species Act and the whole process of reconsidering the status. But coming back to your observation, one is they do die, they do get, tiger sharks, that's their main, well, actually not, they like loggerheads, I take it back. But local
tiger sharks eat loggerheads.
They love loggerheads.
How many species of sea turtles are there? There's only a handful,
there's
right?
Five, and if they're, yes. But the sea turtle used to be served always ceremoniously, and you're right. It's a good question. Most people could live without it. And
people did not like. Okay, Haole people that I talked to about it, just lose their minds over it. Hawaiians didn't seem shook by it at all. Like this is one of those, I tend to bring up things like that people just are like, can't deal, I noticed it's funny. And this is one I was like, okay, this is a sensitive issue. I don't understand why people can't just talk about it without getting it like, we're not actually eating a sea turtle. We're just having a discussion here. But I can see it's very contentious.
But honu, remember, honu is the symbol of Hawaii for many people. That's where you go to see a sea turtle on the beach. So, of course, we've actually seen visitors harassing the sea turtles in the water on the beach. But it's a lack of understanding of the history and the culture, right? Mm-hmm. And that many people depend on sea turtles for food. And in the early days, even the voyagers around the world, remember the Caribbean, sea turtles were taken by sailors, and they were put in the hold, and they were kept live on their backs, and they fed the sailors. That was the protein. Yeah. So there's, even in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, sea turtles have been food. And so going back to Hawaiian sea voyagers, of course it would be appropriate food for surviving. And you don't have to feed sea turtles. It can go a long time without food.
Wow.
But the real...
How long do you think they can go without food? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but...
A long time.
Like months or like a year? Or?
I don't think a year, but we just know that turtles that we find in the wild, back when I used to do more turtle work, a diseased turtle you would find floating, and they look like what we call, cachexic. They're starved looking, and they've probably been that way for a long time. And if they're full of gas, they're positively buoyant. They're not drowning. Wow. They're just, or if they're
stuck at the surface.
Yeah, but it's a tough issue. It's the whole thing. And hello, the native Hawaiians, that's their land and their culture and their food. So if the whole point of the Endangered Species Act is to rebuild the species to a sustainable level. So, but you're right. It's just this perception that, okay, we've done that. So in theory, the Endangered Species Act says if you've done all that, there should be sustainable, like bluefin tuna, when it was thought, they're on the brink of extinction. But if you rebuild a fishery and it's being fished sustainably, harvest is usually allowed. But in the case of these charismatic megafauna,
of which sea turtles are some of the most charismatic, right?
Honu is sacred.
Yeah. When I just think about them, there's sort of, I think they've been associated with serenity and peace and meditation and wisdom and that sort of wisdom that comes from being ancient or something.
And the origin of the earth, the turtle on top of the turtle. But the one more thing about the Hawaiians that say there's still the reverence and the ceremony for the consumption of the meat. Let's face it. There are certainly incidences of broken laws where people shoot them, and we don't know who's doing that. But it's a revered. They honor the food that they eat for those ceremonies.
Right.
So
that's what I get frustrated with when people think that to eat something you must hate it, or you must disdain it, and it's like, well, actually, you can really honor it and still eat it. I think that those aren't mutually exclusive. Though they can be, but they don't have to be. So, I was fascinated by that. You can imagine I'm holding this skull and no part of me wants to put it back down, and my buddy's like, you got to put that back down. He's like, you can't take that. And I was like, I want it so bad, He's like, don't even touch it. put it down. But
you would have I have two that are grandfathered in my shelf a lot. They're small.
They have to be from before the endangered. They were put on the list.
No, because I was permitted, and I was basically cutting up dead turtles of hundreds and hundreds of dead turtles for 2.5 years.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
But after a while, but anyway.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. But okay. So anyway, that was just this anecdote about turtles. But So assuming that I and the people listening don't really know much about Marlin, in particular, striped marlin. Could you kind of give us a bigger picture overview? And I'd love to hear about this paper that you worked on recently.
Well, I have to give all due credit to my collaborator, Dr. Tim Lamb, who's been my long-term partner on bluefin tuna. And actually, everything we do is sailfish, big eye. We worked on big eye, sailfish, and swordfish in the Atlantic. But anyway, Tim just loves striped marlin. He's from Hong Kong, and he knows striped marlin really well. He's eaten, he's had access to the idea of striped marlin, which is Pacific fish. We don't get striped marlin. Mm-hmm. So, and there wasn't much known about it. And so because of the concept of bycatch and the lack of knowledge of what was going on, and of course the regs are going to come down if striped marlin were to be deemed overfished by other participants or fisheries in the Pacific, that would impact Hawaiian fishermen. And so we thought, oh, there's a good reason. Clay Tam, our other main PhD partner, said, hey, we really should work on striped marlin because there's this issue of, are they Hawaiian striped marlin? Are they connected to any other of the fisheries? So there's a big open question. Where are these striped marlin coming from, and could they be related to the Western Pacific or Southwestern Pacific or Eastern Pacific? And so nobody knew. They've been tagged with conventional tags, and a very, very few implanted archival tags were placed in striped marlin.
What's that, an archival tag?
Oh, it's a data logger that you have to put basically in the body of the animal, and the lights
under the skin, or
and say the body peritoneal cavity, so next to the belly,
right in the
and
cavity,
then the stalk sticks out. The light sensor, which is how we geolocate. To sunrise and sunset, we use light-based geolocation to figure out where the
Oh wow!
because the fish aren't coming up and basking long enough.
Yeah.
So remember, that goes back to bluefin tag and everything else. But anyway, there was so little information on the main Hawaiian island striped marlin. Most of the work had been done either by the Taiwanese in the Southwest Pacific or Australia, or off San Diego, and there was not much or Japan. There's not much information on what was happening in the Hawaiian region. And so that's why we embarked with Clay Tam and Tim Lamb and I could we learn more about it. So we submitted proposals, and we got lucky. We were funded by the Salt and Stall Kennedy program in the Pacific region to fund the purchase of 30 pop-up satellite tags. And because
to the tune of,
well, they're at least $4,000 a piece.
Yeah.
And the proposal was to not just to work with the longliner partners, because how else could you get to striped marlin? They're typically not encountered by the inshore fleet, and they come so sporadically we would never run into them enough to do a study. So we trained our partner. Steve Sexton was our main tagger on the Kellyanne, fishing vessel Kellyanne, and together we spent some time saying, okay, these are, and he was experienced tagging captain anyway from other studies, and we said, okay, and can we also, when we run out of the pop-up tags, Steve Sexton and other members of the fleet would also put conventional tags on their released striped marlin, and
what was their incentive to release them if they have this food value?
For science.
They were willing as a result of the work.
One question of the food value, many of them are small, so
okay.
They have a lot more waste, so they couldn't sell them really.
Yeah, okay.
So it was just either release it without a tag,
release it with a tag.
Release it with a tag, and also take a little fin clip for DNA sample.
Okay.
So we could, and that's what also was included in our 2 papers, that we were able to look at finally, not a huge sample, but what DNA profiles did these fish have in relation to fish profiled elsewhere?
Elsewhere, yeah.
And so we published both papers this spring in the Frontiers in Marine Science.
There's 2 papers, so
2 papers, yeah.
What are the topics for the 2?
Well, ideally there would have been 1 paper, but publishing, as you know, has limits and people's attention spans.
Yeah.
So we had so much information from the satellite tag data. We published 1 paper, which was the dispersal patterns throughout the Pacific, and the connectivity to different regions. And the second paper was primarily the vertical behavior and the oceanographic associations.
Vertical behavior, like water column?
Water column. So we knew that each satellite tag records the information on depth, temperature, every couple minutes.
Oh, neat.
So we had these vast data sets. And with both of these, analyses, we were able to basically portray what these 30, they weren't all successful tags. Some of the tags broke, and as you've heard from our bluefin stories, but we were able to portray the behavior of striped marlins and what they did throughout the different directions that they took in the Pacific, and also where they spent most of their time in the water column, and how far north they went to their thermal limits, north and south.
So I want to know about it, but first, could you give us a little bit of like the tail of the tape or the fun facts on these fish so that we get a sense of like who they are, like how big are they, what do they weigh, what do they do?
But see, this is where my colleagues know this. I haven't seen that many personally, striped marlins. I've seen a few on Kauai, but I can tell you what they eat, and I could tell you they're, 70 pounds is a good size.
Okay. They're not huge.
They're not huge.
Small billfish.
They're smaller billfish, and they get bigger, and they're bigger in different parts of the Pacific. But they are eating mostly the small fish in the upper, I'll talk meters, but they're mostly in the top layer of the ocean.
Okay.
And they would do little trips down past the thermocline where there'd be cooler temperatures, but they mostly spend most of their time in the top, say, 100 meters, 120 meters.
Okay.
So they're kind of surface where the bigger marlins and the tunas will go mostly deeper.
Yeah.
Such a cool looking fish. I just looked it up.
Oh, they're pretty.
So beautiful.
Take a look at it.
What do they use the bills for? Do they actually use it to hunt or defend themselves, or?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Don't they kind of knock fish with them?
I can't answer it specifically. I'd be talking, out of my head, but I know more about sword and others. But presumably, you're right that they're using to
Wow, they're pretty.
push their
around.
And
Kind of school them up so that.
yeah, and we've swum with sailfish. I mean, we have observed, and with Guy Harvey, we could see how they fished with their bills. And supposedly, a sword even though they impale things, they're using the swordfish bill. Actually, we're doing a study with Matt Harris and his postdoc in Boston right now. I know I'm diverging, but you asked about the bill. The bills of the billfish, they're all different. They're really different across the whatever you want to call the group. And think about it. And you got yourself a swordfish, and it's like this honk, and you see them above garages, yeah? Mm-hmm. People put particularly around here, swordfish harpooners and stuff. They're solid. They're really something else. Uh-huh. And then you see the sailfish is this beautiful, long, speary thing. But the real question that Matt Harris has, our collaborator, is how does the billfish group, how much does their DNA diversify? In other words, is there a lot of difference between the DNA for the bill of, say, a swordfish versus a sailfish or a spearfish? And
they're all related, or is some of this convergent evolution that they end up?
They're in the same the group of fish.
So this bill originates from some common ancestor, and then they all
and so how do they differ?
out.
But the reason why Matt Harris is interested in his lab is this blows my mind. Matt Harris is at Children's Hospital in Harvard in Boston, and we got put together for the strangest reason. He emailed me out of the blue from website and said, I really need to get to billfish. Can you help me? I know you work on large pelagics. So we got together, and it turns out he's as fishy as they come. He's this cool guy, bearded, but his science interest is he studies jaw deformation and basically genetic errors that result in jaw deformation, and infants are born with deformed jaw. And so his question is, looking at the part of the genome that basically guides, how your mouth, your bill is formed. He's using billfish as his model.
Really?
To see, is it just one, and it's looking like just a few substitutions changes the entire bill. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah, fascinating. Wow.
Sorry, I digress.
That's great. No, it's cool. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So
but back to striped marlin.
Yeah.
So do you want to get into where they do travel and how?
Yeah, I do. I'm just curious. Is there anything else about them you want to say before we get into what you guys learned? You said they're mostly caught on long lines.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're occasionally caught by a charter fleet. I've sampled some that Kauai charter guys have come in with, and so they do show up occasionally on the inner island and the first half mile.
Yeah.
And they're mostly sporadic, and that's why, they're out in the high seas with the longliners for the most part.
Yeah.
And that's probably why not a whole lot of work got done, because it's either a research vessel. Who else is out there?
Yeah.
Except the fishermen.
And some of the bigger and more sort of well-known pelagics probably have gotten more of the research focus, I imagine.
Well, because as you said, the first pop-up satellite tags that were sold went to a very famous Billfish leader in sport fishing. That his goal was to find out where the biggest black marlin were. So he paid for the tag to tag the big black marlin to find out where they were.
So he could catch some big fish. That's interesting.
I will not name him. He's deceased. But that's how it all got underway.
Yeah. Is the situation with the billfish like, are they still catching fish as big as they used to catch?
It depends.
Because it's like with the bluefin, right? You don't see as many of those really big ones like you used to see in the old black and white photos where they're standing there with the weights written on them in white paint or whatever. I mean, you see some fish that are pretty big.
That's probably true. And you can look at, say, the Kona. The big billfish tournament in Hawaii is the Kona tournament. I forget what they call it. But there you can track the sizes of particularly blue marlin. Mm-hmm. Blue and black marlin are the trophy, big fish. But I have to say that... a 700-pound blue marlin is not uncommon, even with the Kawaii guys going out of the harbor. They don't want to catch a 700-pound blue marlin because, as you say, what do you do with it? I mean, it's the flesh, the meat is not particularly prized, but it's smoked. And when you go into the retail markets, smoked blue marlin is delicious. And the same for white marlin in the Atlantic. I mean, it seems like smoked is how it's usually eaten, except for striped marlin. Yeah.
Okay, which is a ceviche or a sashimi fish.
And grilled and stuff. But it's probably more tender. I've eaten it. But.
Yeah. All right, so talk to us about what you guys learned. I mean, very fascinating.
Well, what we learned, like the yellowfin, many of the tracks were tending to where people knew where fishermen run into marlin, both south of main Hawaiian Islands and somewhat to the northeast and northwest. But what, particularly Tim did most of he's our data man. He just has the incredible ability to bring in the remote sensing information, currents, everything else. But we also learned that some of the striped marlin would travel along, what do they call it? Fracture zones. And I thought that was wild. Fracture zones for the volcanic plates.
Oh, yeah.
In the Pacific.
You're talking about like what I can see on a map when there's like lines beneath the sea where you can see the tectonic lines and stuff? Yeah,
and that, I still can't get my head around that.
There must be upwellings from them.
It's got to be upwellings, but the fact that they traveled, it's in our paper, you'll see that they traveled along fracture zones.
Yeah.
It's got to be some
But that's neat that they stay in that sort of top layer, because you'd think that would mean that whatever that phenomenon was comes all the way up to the surface zone.
And what they also did that was not known and unexpected, we did see some striped marlin traveling to higher latitudes than they were known to go to. They were even shallower up there because, of course, they don't want to get into the cooler temperatures. Right. And like the other tunas, their behavior shifts in relation to where they are and what latitude, and their depth patterns would change with their latitudes and sometimes with longitude that we're assuming was associated with these things like the plates or the fracture zones. Yeah. And so we can tell temperature and depth. And we could surmise, the currents and the chlorophyll and basically the productivity in the fronts to the best that we can. But remember that the resolution of our ability to say exactly where the fish was, particularly in a big ocean with no bottom, is there's going to be error of, up to 60 miles.
Oh, yeah.
But for the most part in the Pacific, that's not too bad.
Doesn't matter too much, yeah.
And this is the coolest thing for us is it's all cool, but that one fish that kept its tag on for 1 year, we never would have expected when it came off right on schedule, which is a rare event because as you remember, we've had tag hardware technology problems. That fish, no one expected it to be there. And when we told the stock assessment people that were, striped marlin is a big issue in the Pacific right now, and the stock assessments are ongoing, and we told them where the tag came off. They couldn't believe it. They said, "Oh my God!"
You said in
Because
Australia, right?
off Australia, and
So it's not like the tag floated up to Australia. It actually released
off
from the fish
on
there.
time.
Yeah.
So we have all the
What causes
data.
it? How does it do that?
That is programming. So it's it's a data logger. It's a computer in
But it releases itself, though.
It has an electronic. Basically, your
little charge or something.
Sends a charge and it says release now.
Yeah.
And then the charge burns through. It sends a charge that burns through the metal.
God, that fish must be like, ooh, that felt good when that thing comes off. A little bit of drag.
Yeah, I bet. So the tether's left in the fish. It's ever recaptured. But the real question is, okay, so we have the whole, for the most part, the path down to off Brisbane, and there's some tag. I'm trying to remember. So there's fishery down there for them. I mean, in that area of the Pacific, and of course we have the main Hawaiian Islands. Fishermen that are encountering them, but we presume they come back. And that's because there's records of catch between Brisbane and Hawaii, but no one ever thought they were the same fish, potentially.
Yeah.
So what we didn't document, and we can only infer, is the round trip is that fish coming back to Hawaii. But the interesting thing was, usually a migration is a full circle, right? A year between spawning and feeding and going back, one or the other. And so many trips, many fish that we've tagged with satellite tags, no matter what species, make round trips. So they have a return to their favorite places, like we would, right? Yeah. So we just can't say. And an N of one fish,
right.
And one of the few tags that didn't fall apart before its due date.
So this is like a jumping off point for the next work, to try to figure out if this is an anomaly or is this something that these fish are routinely doing.
The biggest challenge for us is that funding came in 2016. It took us 3 years with our collaborator, our partners, to do the analysis, and then the funding's over. Yeah. And then it's up to the feds to put out a call for proposals, and sometimes they say, "Oh, we like that. Thanks, we're going to do it this time."
Yeah. Yeah, you'd almost imagine as a layperson that there's some kind of more intelligent top-down funding scheme to make sure that everything is learned about, but it's hardly like that, huh?
Well, it helps if there's a fisheries issue. So, in fact, I personally like ahi because it's the most important species in the islands, and there's still huge stuff to know there, but we can't get funding for it. We haven't been able to.
Because they're abundant?
Because they're abundant and they're not in danger, then there's no driving management crisis.
We'll wait till there's a crisis. Something that really blew my mind out there. So for a few days, because when we got there, I was like, wow, great poke. This is awesome. Like, I'm really enjoying eating
What
like that.
months were you there?
We were there, early August?
Oh, summer.
Yeah.
Oh, you were just there.
Yeah, late July, I think.
Late July.
So high season for fish. They're all there then.
Yeah, we were there was fish everywhere. And one of the things that I kept seeing is I'd go into a supermarket or a convenience store and there'd be like poke in the deli section, sitting under plastic wrap, and
everyone's like, it's good.
Everyone kept telling me you can eat, and I was like, you can eat that?
From the 7-Eleven.
It felt like there's no way I can eat raw fish from the 7-Eleven. And everyone's like, no, seriously, you can. And once I started doing that, well, first of all, it saved me a lot of money because we could eat that instead of going to the poke truck or whatever. But there's good fish available, like you said, even at convenience stores and stuff, but particularly in the supermarket, to be able to walk in and come out with all of this beautiful poke meat. It was really neat to me.
Well, I don't want to burst your bubble.
Please burst it.
But particularly on Molokai, I would imagine, traditionally people got their food at the convenience stores, the 7-Elevens, and friends like Malasadas, the Portuguese donuts, they got their poke, they got their musubi.
That's the
Of course,
spam.
we didn't get to musubi yet, but
we had those ones warm that morning. It was so good. You missed out. You're talking about the spam sushi kind of thing, right?
Yeah, well, they put everything in there. You could have all kinds of musubi.
Okay.
But anyway, not all. Probably Molokai, when they tell you that's local, absolutely. Some lady or some mom and pop down the street probably made it. That's not true everywhere. And in fact, I thought you were going to raise the issue of, which comes back to the Kawaii Project.
Yeah.
The grocery stores are no longer locally, most of them. I don't know Molokai. Molokai could be very well an exception because of where it is. But the sad, sad in my view, and for many fishermen, is that the poke that is sold in many big outlets, including grocery stores that are no longer locally owned, has been imported from the Philippines or elsewhere and is frozen, and it's cut and processed, and in some cases carbon monoxide. And when you go into the grocery stores, you have to read the sign, and even the big sign, fresh local fish. But if you read down on the poke, there sometimes there's a line of the poke mixes, and some of them will say local, and it's more expensive. And then if you read the fine print, it'll say previously frozen, and it won't say U.S. or it won't say local. And some of them now don't even offer the local, and at least maybe since COVID, things are getting better. But the whole, our Kawaii Project, and not just Kawaii, but it's about we should be able to sell our own fresh local fish. And the biggest challenge is these big retail outlets that are now multinational corporations get their bulk processed fish from these central depots, and it's distributed, not in all cases. But the good news is, since COVID, there's a growing awareness that poke should be sourced locally and not brought in from international sources.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's making me think of our friend, our shooter Phil that we worked with out there. Fantastic camera operator and director, and he was convinced he didn't like dragon fruit. And we were given some by a local friend that were of that sort of red-purple variety inside, and just perfumey and sweet and delicious. And he was like, I don't understand. I've been eating these like bland white-fleshed ones. And we're like, well, dude, where are those coming from? They're not even Hawaiian. They're coming from who knows where. Like, these grow here. But he had been eating, commercial ones that who knows what the country of origin was. But
flown, not grown.
Flown, not grown. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, makes sense with fish too. I'm sure we could probably find mangoes from elsewhere and papayas from elsewhere there too, right? So
absolutely. But the difference in the flavor, as you know, and avocados, oh my God.
And it tends, it's like a lot of times because it's the varietal, that's being grown in somebody's yard versus the one that's being grown for commercial export, right? Because you're like looking for a variety that ships well and doesn't bruise and has no flavor. But anyway, so not all the fish is
no, read the fine print and then ask them. And of course, in some of they'll just not tell you the truth.
Yeah, right.
So of course it's local, but what's been interesting to learn, particularly when deep diving into why and what's up, that was our Kawaii diversification project. I was able to interview particularly the famous local market on Kauai that was known to buy only local, and I met the chief buyer, who was a woman. She grew up there. I forget her name at the moment, but she gave me such a beautiful interview of her challenges and because they would sell out. You'd go there and you couldn't get the poke, and they would buy. You could buy ahi, or if you go early, from certain fishermen. But the reason why I said you could keep selling this, why? She said, I don't have the labor. Fish cutters are hard to find now. The entire issue of labor affects every aspect of the market, as you probably know. But it blew my mind that one of the problems was, even though the fishermen are catching and bringing it back to the dock, these purveyors that would love to buy it don't have the personnel or the time to process it.
I'm still waiting for a cogent explanation from somebody about what's happened to our labor force. I do not understand. You would think it's like musical chairs. Everybody gets up, moves around, and the same number of people sit down in the same number of chairs, but it's not like that since COVID. You'd think okay, people left jobs, but then they just reorient and go to other jobs. I don't understand, because everywhere I go has a shortage. It seems like everywhere. Yes. Things are closed. They're not operating at their hours that they advertise. Every restaurant you go to, it's kind of smart to call in advance now.
I see tons of seats open. And they're like, sorry, we can't seat you.
Yeah.
We don't have the waiters.
There's no staff. Workers. You're like, there's all these open seats. They're like, no, we don't have any servers. But it's not just that. It seems like everywhere. So where what are all these people? I remember there was a time where you could make pretty good money not working, like during COVID, there was like some really big money being given out for unemployment, but those days are like behind us. So I'm like, and nobody's living off that few $1,000 they got. So like, where is everybody?
I don't know. It's tremendous opportunity. Honestly,
that's what I think too.
I really seriously thought, for a lot of reasons, I'd really like to learn to cut fish.
Yeah.
I'm an expert. I'm dead serious.
Right.
One, maybe I can have a job doing it, but also just, why not?
Yeah, it's just so interesting you say that.
I could dissect, but I'm not.
Right.
And there
from
are
a culinary perspective.
From those great fish cutters that I know, and most of them are older now. And why wouldn't you have a fish cutting training, module in the community college or somewhere, high school?
Yeah.
But anyway,
I've been saying, it's funny you say that, because I've been talking about how I see that this is an opportunity where if you're a motivated person, you can really jump the line and get jobs you wouldn't have been able to get before. There's nobody in front of you now, and if you're good and you're willing to learn, you could pick up skills like bypass school or bypass trainings, or like, because people need people so badly. Like there's
at good money too.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is
Absolutely.
like you can wash dishes for $20 an hour now. It's amazing.
With paid vacation.
Yeah, or shared ownership and profit sharing and stuff,
Benefits.
Yeah, it's a really strange moment, but I don't understand it, because I just don't know people that are like, well, yeah, I just stopped working a couple of years ago and I've just been home. It's like, who are these people? But so you don't have an answer to this either.
no, I have no answer.
I keep saying that to people. I'm waiting for somebody to be like, oh, Daniel, it's simple. It works like this.
But I've seen there's some rays of hope. I just know there's a fish company. If we get back to the fish, like the better news. But I don't want to miss something I want to tell you about Hawaii before we forget it. But the people that are paying attention to fresh local, and we've talked since COVID, they're really good signs particularly for our fisheries and our fishermen, and then the awareness of only expecting to have the fish that are in season and stuff in the Wells Farm. But I'm seeing in Gloucester, for example, there's a young couple. He's a lobsterman. I know them because she went to UNH where I was a professor. They started the Gloucester Lobster Company, and I may not get the name right. And I always thought of them, they have a great, successful little lobster business down the street from where we live. In the last year, while I've been gone on Kauai, they've diversified, and then they opened up just right in front of the fish plant. They have a counter.
Yeah.
And then they have the thing, and you've seen it, like New England Fishmongers and others. It's amazing. And the people that are working there are two young women, and they're going to move into a bigger retail space. And I thought, and they were good, and they knew their fish, and I thought, that's a good sign. They're
from
young
the fisherman
people.
to the consumer, without all of this in between.
Right, but the
about.
people working at the fish plant, that the fact that the company was founded by these young people, young lobsterman and his wife who went to UNH, and then that the people that they hired, the women, they were clearly good at what they did, and so they gave me hope that there's new people coming in.
Yeah, and disrupting what's been a pretty established way of doing business for a long time, right? When we last visited you to podcast, we left there feeling like we had the thumbs up to eat bluefin, which was really exciting. So then we were like, the whole drive home, we were trying to find some bluefin.
And now we can eat sea turtles too.
Yeah.
No. Only in ceremonial purposes.
That's what I like about you, Molly. You always have good news.
But we did.
My career is over.
That's hilarious. That's really funny. We did, though, try to find bluefin the whole way home and ended up having yellowfin. Since then, we fished with our friend Captain Ryan Bonner, and we got connected to New England Fishmongers. We are now connected to a sushi place over in Bridgeton, Maine that serves bluefin. And you just sent me an article yesterday about Dave Marciano from what's his boat?
Wicked Tuna.
Yeah, what's his boat called? The
Angelica.
Real Merchandise? or
Hard
something?
merchandise.
Hard merchandise.
And Angelica.
Okay, so Angelica is the company that they're selling it under, right? So they're starting a direct-to-consumer bluefin, and it looks like Gulf of Maine fishery kind of.
Yep.
Like, they're going to be doing ground fish and lobster and stuff too. So direct-to-consumer, because it hasn't been that easy for people to get fish out of the fisheries the way you'd think.
Incredible.
Right?
I mean, I couldn't believe it, and I mean, I've been wailing on this topic for so long. The distribution chain and the distribution model has been so messed up. To see fishermen not get a decent dollar return on a good, healthy, delicious fish because there's no way to, no one to cut it and to distribute it, etc., and nobody to buy it, and that just seemed crazy. But what they're up against, as you remember, for many years, hopefully that's going to be put away, is the idea was they're endangered, which you remember they're certainly not. They've been rebuilt, and they were probably they were fairly sustainable fishery for a very long time. Rebuilt, and secondly, we wouldn't have a U.S. fishery if these fish weren't being fished sustainably. It just wouldn't happen, no matter what anyone else tells you. And so they're getting off the red list now, and they're on the yellow list, which I think is still bogus. But anyway, but the second thing was the methyl mercury, that if you eat bluefin, which is supposedly the most methyl mercury, it's dangerous, and etc. And so the fishery was up against those two big things. And then finally, the market and the dealers, their convention was to serve Japan and that market that first developed. And over the decades, you know, the sushi market took off in the U.S. And so there were some high-level restaurants and people that were purchasing the fish that had the volume. But just what you said, you couldn't go down to your local seafood retail and buy bluefin steaks until very, very recently, and only sporadically. And that is crazy, because meanwhile, as we have so many fish in our Gulf of Maine, as you know, fishermen now, the dealers are shutting down. There's too many fish. The market is flooded. But the market is so-called flooded because the market has been very narrow.
Yep.
And so that is, I think that's the crux of the problem that hopefully is going to improve.
It's because we're sending to Japan? Why is it so narrow?
Because there's so few outlets, right? You're saying like there's not a lot of final destinations for people to actually access the fish.
There haven't been, and the second thing is the worldwide market and suppliers of bluefin have changed radically since.
I'm hearing a lot of like, we don't get what we used to get from Japan for these fish.
Right, because the med farmed fish, farmed and fattened, New Zealand, the fish that
they're
are
farmed tuna.
So they're catching
really?
these. They're more like ranched in a sense,
yes,
right?
Yes, ranch is
they're
better.
They're catching these fish in the wild and then rearing them in captivity, right? Fattening them in captivity. They're not raising them in captivity, or they're not hatching them.
Man, what does that look like for bluefin? They're such big fish.
Big pens, and you're right. It's funny. You're right. It is. We used to distinguish, but now everyone just says farmed.
Yeah, of course.
But you're right. It is ranch. They're not, except for the Japanese that do raise them from eggs.
Really?
Absolutely, and been 3 or 4 generations now.
Yeah.
They were the first to do it, and they've been trying to do that, reproduce it in the med. But it's because the other thing was Japan used to expect a fatty fish for the toro, and so. When our fish were no longer fattening, and we've talked about that why over the years, now we have more bluefin being caught easily. And then the second thing is their body conditions have gone up and down, waxed and waned over the years and the decades. And now we have a lot of fish, and we also know that they're spawning nearby and later in the season than has been traditionally either known, and also we didn't see fish come in that were in such lean condition. And we used to think it's related to herring, and in my lab, I had students that studied that and looked at herring condition and availability, but we now know it's not just that, it's also the reproductive status. So if fish are spawning later in season than when the Gulf of Mexico is a spring spawning season for big old fish. But the smaller, younger fish, as we talked about, based on tagging and everything else, appear to be spawning mostly in the Atlantic and they're spawning all the way up till July. So if they've spawned and decide to come into our local waters, it's going to be months before they can have enough food to put
the fat
back in the mussel. And so
after spawning, they're lean.
They're lean, of course.
Fishermen here in the Gulf of Maine are catching them, and they're catching lean fish, you're saying?
That's part of the story that we believe, and
as opposed to it being, they don't have enough forage anymore because there's less herring,
or they just, and it's all complicated, but we presume that those fish have been spawning out there for a very long time, but we presume that they kept going, so they weren't necessarily the fish that were, we never saw bluefin in the condition that we've been seeing there when we talked about the gonads. We started in 1994 looking at gonads, ovaries. And we didn't see the kind of ovaries that we've been seeing here until much later, like 2018, where we said, oh, wait a minute, that fish is either very close or recently spawned, and it's got no body fat, and there's a lot more of those fish. So,
do you think the spawning's relatively new here?
No, I think what's new is those fish are coming in to the Gulf of Maine, where the Canadians didn't start, and they still don't. They don't start their fishery till later, usually September, October. They wait till the fish that show up are fattened, and it's only a hypothesis. But I presume that the fish that were spawning where they spawn, where we know they're spawning in the Slope Sea, kept going, north and east, and maybe if they showed up on the western, areas, they were Canadian. That makes sense. It's consistent with the condition that they arrived in Canada versus the condition they arrived in here. But again, we don't know for sure.
It's a hard thing to study, huh? You just have everything's obfuscated by water.
And time and but we're going back up. Finally, yay, hallelujah! After waiting 3 years, we're funded by the province of Nova Scotia and the fishery to go back with our long-term partners, the Jacquards, and we're going to, while they're harvesting bluefin in September, we'll be finally pulling out the pituitaries and the hypothalami.
Yeah.
Sure. We'll need another podcast after you're done with that. I
usually only have one to think about.
For hormones.
You'll be going up there this September?
Yeah, we're going up to finally get
cool.
Wow. Because, like we said, even when they spawn, their follicle, that the signs of spawning, because they're warm-bodied fish, compared to all the other tunas, they basically recycle those follicles, and they call them post-ovulatory follicles. So they disappear, we think, between 48 hours and, a very short window. So that fish, if it spawned a month ago or 3 weeks ago, you may see a big sort of flaccid ovary, but you're not going to see the evidence of spawning that you might have seen in a big eye or a yellowfin, because bluefin are warm.
Yeah.
And so they speed through everything.
Wow.
So that's why they say, it didn't spawn. Well, wait a minute. We now know from hormones a lot more about it, because you are what your hormones are.
Yeah. There's a lot of big fish up in Nova Scotia, huh? That's where I've seen some documentaries about the bluefin up there.
There are all kinds of sizes up there. It's the biggest fish are generally up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they're the fish that seem to go to the Gulf of Mexico. Big old fish like those areas.
Yeah.
But where we go off the coast, south of Halifax, it's an incredible mixing zone, and that's by the way where the great whites are showing up now too.
That far north.
Great whites in the last 10 years, it's unbelievable. So now all the taggers are going up there. They all want to get their tags on the great whites. They weren't there 10, 15 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, Greg Scommel turned us on to Sharktivity, the app, where all their tagged sharks are in the Gulf of Maine,
Yeah.
And this...
Greg's going up there, by the way, we hear this.
To Nova Scotia?
To fish with... Well, he talked about fishing with our captain.
Oh, cool. All right, we're going to be up there knocking on the door.
Is a bluefin the only warm-blooded fish?
For the most part, yeah, warm-bodied.
Warm-bodied.
And makos, warm. They're warm too from mussel too. But yeah, the other tuna is maybe a degree warmer than than the ocean. But bluefin are up 18 degrees sometimes warmer than the water they're in. But I learned something new about bluefin. I didn't know this. they heat their eyes too. I know swordfish heat their eyes, and I know bluefin heat their bellies, but I didn't know that they heat their eyes. Finally, I saw there's Japanese papers for tiny, and they were studying when they had the capability to raise the temperatures, and this is cool. They don't have what they call the reed, the vascular reed, which is the blood vessels arranged like a radiator, so the warm body. So
like heat exchange kind of.
Heat exchange. They heat their eyes from the muscular contraction of the muscles around the eye.
Wow, neat.
The bluefin.
Okay, so it's local. It's not from the blood supply.
It's local. It's so cool.
Wow. Yeah, because their vision's kind of renowned, huh? I know when we were fishing them, you remember Ryan had hooks that he had hand painted the hooks to match the bait fish. So he had mackerel hooks and he had squid hooks, and he had painted them so that when they were in the fish, they just blended to the fish. And he's just convinced, no, they can see it. They can see it. And you're like, they do have pretty good eyes. I don't know what to say.
Can I ask one more thing about bluefin? How do you feel about the farms? The farms and the ranches, is that something responsible to do? Is it dangerous?
I don't have a whole lot of personal. I've been to them, and I know that the issues are all about: is there an impact, like the salmon farms, on the local habitat, and what happens to what are they fed? What's in the feed? Are they fed natural stuff? But whatever it is, it's done. The Japanese prefer, in many cases, I'm told, prefer that fattened fish because it's a consistent product.
Yeah.
It's all about the product. And coming back to that, if you remember, I don't know if we talked about it, but remember we had tagatini, so we had a fish that had a satellite tag on it, and we got the data from it for a year. It was tagged on Stellwagen, or hope I'm getting my fish stories right. But 7 years later, it was they finally recovered the tag in a farmed fattened fish that was put on the deck, and they saw our tether that was in the fish that had been fattened, and we had pictures of it at harvest, and that was actually it was off of Canary Islands. It was a Canary Island.
You guys tagged a tiny,
we have
a short fish, and it got captured and put into one of the ranches.
They're in pens. We've had probably at least 4 or 5 fish that they found our tags when the fish was, after fattening, harvested and put on the deck, and not just 1 or 2. And one of them happened to have had a satellite tag tether in it, but there were others with the conventional tags deployed by fishermen in our Tagatini program.
Wow.
So in the Med, off Canary Islands, Malta, and Spanish traps, and the French purse seines, a couple of them were caught off of, I want to say, west of France, and then towed to the pen where they're put in and they're fattened.
Whoa.
But it's the market. This is where a market person
I hate that. I don't like it.
Yeah.
I just emotionally right off, I don't like it. I keep thinking about the incredible freedom that these fish experience. Yeah. So the idea of the pens, I don't like. And then the other thing about it, though, is when you look at most the diseases that are epidemic in people, they're zoonotic.
Yeah.
And when you look at indigenous hunter-gatherer people, they were free of many of these diseases because they didn't live with livestock. So like most of our diseases, we're getting them from birds, we're getting them from pigs, we're getting them from cattle. And then you look at what happens too with people when you start to live a city life versus a rural life, and now you have this incredible disease transmission. So you start to pile these bluefin together in these pens. Like, it just sounds to me like you're going to have rapid mutation of whatever, bacteria, viruses they have, and then it just seems like a recipe for more zoonotic disease. Maybe not that's transmissible to people, but isn't good for the animals. And then, of course, it sounds like that then gets out into the ocean. Like, that's my concerns. And it's just not good to pile a bunch of wild animals together like that usually.
Well, the one thing I know about is the smaller fish. there are many papers on the blood parasites that are found in particularly juvenile fish, and you're right, they are transmitted probably from fecal, and they're mostly pericardial, they're blood flukes that are found in the hearts, that they don't hurt humans. But the bigger fish, I just don't know. They're already big, but I would imagine that if it's an issue, the Japanese are studying it,
working on it,
because they are definitely one of the biggest markets for these.
Committed to the eating bluefin.
Yeah, and raising them. But and they do an awful lot. I'm just amazed at the amount of research they do. But it's a fair question.
Yeah, you guys have access to all that research? Are they good at sharing their...
Much more is being published now, but there's certainly...
keep some of it close to the chest.
Yes, yeah. And
for commercial reasons?
Well, they were the only people that could raise bluefin from eggs for many years.
Yeah, so that's pretty valuable.
They shared in their, they came to the Med and they were consultants, and their companies are in the Med. So I know a lot has been learned, but even the research on all other aspects of bluefin has really just blossomed in the last decade in Japan, because they have them in captivity and can do everything.
Yeah. Interesting. And their tastes have shifted towards a more consistent product. I don't like that either.
What age do they harvest them, I wonder?
Well, they catch what they catch, which are
but the ones that they raise from eggs.
Oh, that's a good question.
I wonder.
I think between three, and they're also studying them, so they know who the parents are.
Man,
they've done the genetics
to
see. Is it just a couple of fish that are responsible for the offspring, or what's the representation of the genome? But they closed the cycle. It's been at least 10 or 15 years. No.
Where is it heading, man?
I don't know.
It's heading to where corporations own the genomes of specific.
Right.
Hey, artificial meat, artificial tuna. I mean, that's where it's headed. It's already there.
Oh, I hate it.
I know.
I asked myself this question: is civilization? Because we're not the first one. There's plenty of remnants, and are civilizations like a game of Jenga, where the tower can only get so high before it's unstable and it kind of collapses on itself, or can we possibly be the first one that can trend forever on this infinite growth paradigm? Because you look at some of the stuff we're doing and you think, wow, we're really close to some really weird stuff, and then I wonder, how close to some weird stuff were Egyptians? You know what I mean? How far can this game of Jenga go? Can we keep pulling blocks from the bottom and putting them on the top?
But they couldn't go to Mars. That's what I figured. It's just we're ultimately headed for our humans to live elsewhere.
Well, what a nice looking place. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Please, why would we want to be in Hawaii? We could go to.
But let's have happy thoughts and talk about how delicious the.
Yeah. Well, I actually I am curious about the. Just generally speaking, with the issue we were just talking about with the breakdown between the boat and the consumer, is that something that you think largely is going to start shifting, or is this thing deeply, deeply entrenched? Why can people not get? Is it just going to take new blood coming in to the fisheries and then just saying, hey, let's try a different business? There's nothing actually restricting a fisherman from selling his fish or her fish direct to the public, or is there?
There is right now, and although I don't think it's insurmountable, it is basically the tag that goes on the fish. So the dealers are right now the only people that are allowed. Registered dealer with the National Marine Fisheries has the tag that goes on the bluefin, then it's taken all the way to the sale location, so to Japan. So anybody that handles a bluefin has to be able to put the tag on it. So
it's like a CITES tag or something?
I guess it's an SCI. It's a good question, but I think it must be an ICAT tag. The Commission, International Commission.
Right.
But one would think, I need to look into it, but I thought, how does one get that? How do you identify yourself as a dealer? And that's all for counting. That's just like deer tags. Yeah. So it's not, one would think that's it. It's for making sure that every fish is counted.
Accounted for.
But to my impression of the answer to your question, in my opinion, one, I think it's thinking differently to get past the dealer mentality that they've had a tough time, bluefin dealers. The market is absolutely volatile and unpredictable, et cetera, closure days. But they also, I think, conventionally thought of the market as the Japanese market or a few other outlets. But if you could get past this ability to put the tag on the fish, then it's a business. Then you're a fish. Then you're a fish business. You can.
Right.
What's the difference between a bluefin and a big eye and a yellowfin, as far as that? So the other thing is to create the market to deal with the perceptions that it's bad for you, toxic from methylmercury, and two, to deal with the perception from many people, including chefs and many other people, that Atlantic bluefin should not be eaten because they're threatened or endangered. So those are things that we can address with facts. So once you think okay, let's take care of that, and that's through getting information out to the public. And then the second thing is that this is healthy, high omegas. We talked about that, but then lastly, who's going to do it? And I think, as you know, people like the New England fishmongers and a few others. I heard that Hannaford actually has purchased bluefin, and that in Maine,
really,
that there are times when you could buy
our local supermarket
bluefin,
chain, basically.
but it doesn't seem to be consistent.
Okay, well, that's neat that they were doing that.
And Dave Marciano, Dave's a friend. I know him even before Wicked Tuna, and when I've heard that, it's like, oh my God, this is such a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is Dave, because of his Wicked Tuna fame and following, he knows that he already has a market.
Yeah.
And he already knows all this stuff about bluefin, and I've been talking about it for a while, and I see it as, if it has to be Dave Marciano because of his notoriety, so be it. A rising tide lifts all boats. And if they see that Dave Marciano and Intershell, which is the Gloucester fish company, the plant, if he could do it, and presume they're going to FedEx it and do other things. He's got that sort of niche, which could be national because that's where his fans are. But anybody that has a bluefin fisherman like the mongers, why not?
Yeah.
And
right.
individual fishermen have, shipped to Florida restaurants. I know Corky Decker, who was a fisherman out of Maine and Gloucester, was supplying fish to restaurants in Florida a couple of years ago, et cetera, et cetera. But I just would like to be able to go to my local retail market when I want a piece of bluefin, which I haven't had very much of in the last many years, and make poke.
Yeah.
Or have a little, sashimi. Why not?
Yeah. I think
it's ridiculous.
I recently bought a car, and I was like, okay, this market's changing. Like, I was, all that rigmarole used to be, like, you go in to buy a car, and there was, like, a lot of games that you had to play with the person before you could finally walk out of there with the vehicle. And this was just, like, so straightforward. It was like going in and buying a gallon of milk or something. It was just, like, none of that. And I was like, wow, this market's changed. And then I'm seeing a lot of new vehicles that are coming in from, battery operated vehicles that it seems like you don't have to go through the same dealership experience you used to have to do. So my point is, like, it's kind of similar. Like, you couldn't just go to Toyota and buy a Toyota direct. You had to go through the dealers, and the dealers controlled the whole market, and the dealers controlled the price, and they'd size you up, and what do you know, and here's what you end up paying. And it's like, man, can we get rid of the go-between so I can just directly get the thing? And it seems like that with fisheries. That's what I'd like to see, is where I can just buy directly, or at least very close to the source. Because outside of the bluefin, is there anything preventing other fish, for instance here, like, can a boat sell its haddock, pollock, rockfish?
It's all about, HI health. Everything has to be inspected, meat and. So you can see where the challenge is for a fisherman or fisher to, I consider women fishermen too. That's just my old school view. Yes. But you have to have the certified kitchen, certified health inspection. Okay, that's where dealers... The good thing about the dealers is they're inspected and et cetera. So there has to be that health level, and that's the challenge. And the certification process, you pay money, you have to take the courses. So, but if you invest in that, like any other business, if you are willing to do that, then things open up. And I just think even our dealers, they've struggled. Many of them have gone out of business. It's a tough business, as you know.
Low margins.
So low margin and unpredictability. So I don't blame them I appreciate what they've been up against. But But I do think it will take, like you said, the new vision, which is, hey, wait a minute, we could do this differently, think differently. And an example of how things have changed elsewhere is the tuna, tuna dock, San Diego tuna dock. Some of the people, businesses, thinkers that have diversified, changed their market chain, everything. I was able to, over a couple of years for our Kawaii Project, to research and investigate who is doing things differently. How have people diversified their supply chain, their fish, and in places where they call it a seafood desert, even though, like Hawaii, even though there's fish everywhere, or Molokai, there's fish everywhere. Your fishermen are catching, but they can't sell it. They don't have outlets. So the San Diego tuna dock, Pete Halme, he was one of the founders. He's a longtime sea urchin diver. He's in his 80s, and he's still sea urchin diving. But
Where?
In San Diego, he and a group of fishermen, among many things they did, they finally convinced through some very savvy thinking and marketing at the San Diego dock where they are, got local legislators to support the capability to turn that dock into a fish dock where boats could come in and legally sell their fish, set up.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And it's a huge draw.
Cool.
And then in Port Orford, Oregon, some other people at this direct to market CSF's Fisherman in Port Orford, Oregon, that was also a seafood desert, and they started a direct to market and direct to farmers markets. Mike Barron and what's his partner? I'm just too many things on my mind, but we brought 13 of these experts to the Kawaii question: how do we change our market? How do we open this up, add value, micro canneries, et cetera, et cetera? So coming back to bluefin, there's a Mainer that's even canning bluefin. He ships it to the Oregon canners, where our goddaughters and her captain husband have their albacore canned. And we talked about the bespoke cans, but bluefin can be smoked, it can be canned, all the same thing as other species. So the market can be so much bigger and more diverse, and that's going to take creative business people or people that are ready to do it.
What is for somebody listening to this, like, what's the opportunity that is out there? You know what I mean? Like, if somebody's listening to this, they're like, man, I'd kind of like to get involved in this somehow. Like, is there, outside of those people who are boat captains or own boats, is there like an opportunity here that people don't realize?
Well, I'm not a fisherman, and I just know it's so hard. But the one thing I learned from all of these our experts is that most of them went after grant money because you need the infrastructure either for the plant, the facility, the training. So almost every group started with a FDA loan. And in many cases, even in Hawaii, even the people that work for the FDA didn't realize it's not just ag. These seafood ocean producers are eligible for FDA grants. Nobody ever pushed it or went after it, but a couple of them.
FDA, not USDA.
Sorry, FDA, USDA. Sorry, my bad. I think you're right.
USDA.
It's USDA, and so there's money there to start. So development money, and not every one of them usually after 3 years transition to for-profit.
Yeah.
And some of them now they're building a brewery next to in Port Orford. It was so popular, people coming down to buy fish, that they create these new spaces.
Kind of gentrifies the whole area a little bit, essentially.
Yeah, and coming back to Dave Marciano's, Angelica's, I think that's just one model. And Dave is Dave, but why not sell?
Yeah.
Why not smoke bluefin? But as long as you have the health, all the...
Yeah.
But it would be so much. I've had smoked bluefin. It's so good.
Oh, I'd love to
try do that.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff happening. I'm fascinated by what's going on in Australia with Josh Nyland and what he's doing, exploring fish butchery and fish aging and all of that. And then we've got a friend here on the East Coast in D.C. area, Andrew Choi. You familiar with what he's doing with the Ikejime Federation? That's his sticker right there on my bottle. So, the Ikejime thing is the Japanese method of killing the fish. So it's spike to the brain and then a wire run through the vertebral column there. And so he's been working with commercial and recreational to try to bring ikejime in, and obviously like there's circumstances where I can't really picture it like on a pollock boat, for instance, a ground fishing boat. I can't imagine all the fish being done this way, but I can on a bluefin boat.
And it is done on.
Yeah, in Japan, right? It's like how it's done. So, so he's trying to make this a new product category, so to speak, of a higher grade of fish, and he's looking at it down to the microscopic level, like what goes on in the enzymatic process when a fish is killed this way versus this way, and stress is reduced and energy is taken out of the nervous system and all of that. And so, he sees that as a new category and a way for American fishermen to get a premium on their product. He's a pretty interesting guy, and so I'm just seeing these neat things happening that are like really exciting to me. There's a lot of room.
The bluefin have been. I forgot that was the name for the. That was my job on the white dove too, on the purse seiner. Wow. But the issue, not the issue is, but you're so right that the idea that the its metabolism is stopped right at death is important for bluefin, but even though that will work great on the immediate harvest, on the purse seiners, the fish have been dead a little while.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Right.
So, but nonetheless, that it was a 300-pound test mono or even bigger was meant to be found in the fish. So the fish were processed with the mono for that purpose specifically. So then when it arrived in Japan, it had the mono. It was basically found.
Even if it hadn't died that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It died in the purse seine.
Yeah. Right.
But
they get a higher value for it.
Yeah. And as a physiologist, I knew exactly why they wanted to do it, and lacked, all the tuna burn and all that stuff. But everybody knows it's been dead for a while.
Yeah. It's fake.
But it was appearance was important.
Yeah.
But coming back to using all the fish, I do want to get something in that a very famous and incredible innovator in fish. His name is Santa. I probably talked to you about him. That was his nickname. Oh my God, I forget his actual name. He was the owner and at Takurate, one of the top sushi restaurants in the United States, was in Honolulu.
Okay.
And Chef Santa and his partner Kazu. There's an incredible story in his obituary. He had an accident. Basically, he was young and in his prime. He was fixing his house, and he fell off a ladder and presumably had a brain bleed. But he had innovated so many, what do you call it? Ikejime. But that's where all the fishermen went. We all went. If you wanted the mind-blowing fish, you sat at the table, and you were served the most exquisite seafood sushi. And in the last couple of years during COVID, he was innovating use of vegetables, and right up your alley. He yam and all these wild vegetables, and umami was his goal. He didn't want to, I think for medical reasons, he couldn't eat meat anymore, and he decided he was planning on opening a vegetarian restaurant, but with these wild combinations of vegetables and everything else, and plants that were not traditionally thought of as food, and making these wild. He was just an incredible man, and no one could believe it. I mean, he died probably last month.
Oh, okay.
And his Takurate was his, landmark little up second floor where every chef went in there, and it was just a tragedy. Yeah.
So we won't be eating there.
Sounds right up our alley, I was going to say.
Well, we don't know. I mean, his partner, Kazu, I can't imagine that they would close. But we missed. They had a send-off party at Takurate, and I just thought that would have been one hell of a celebration.
Yeah. Wow. And one thing I wanted to ask you, because you keep mentioning it, and we haven't really defined it, but you keep saying the Kawaii Project. I just want to give you space to say what it is you were talking about. I'm gaining
Kawaii,
a picture.
Well, Kawaii was all about, we have the fish, but our fishermen, we have a plethora of ahi, of yellowfin, and they're beautiful, and yet all this fish being sold to tourists and restaurants, so much of it is not local.
Yeah.
And what can be done to change that? And clearly it hadn't been done over all those years, and it's barely done on some of the other islands. So the idea was, well, how have they done this elsewhere? And that's where I spent the year and a partner at PhD looking who's done what. And I met these extraordinary people, including people I already knew from the East Coast, Bob Campbell from Seabrook, and actually Red's Best, Jared Auerbach, who is an incredible innovator early days. Not that early, he's a young man. But we invited them to share how they did it.
Oh, okay.
And in the process also interviewed the locals, found out, the restaurants, the chefs, the hotel guys, where do you buy your fish, etc. What would it take for you to buy locally? What's keeping you from buying locally, and etc. And so we compiled that information. We hosted 3 online workshops. They're going to be like mini TED Talks. It's basically we're creating a curriculum, and so that will be for the community, fishermen, buyers, everything, to think about it. Like, whoa, can we change this? Can we have a central processing kitchen? Can we have a tuna dock like in San Diego? What can we do to create sustainability and to best use the fish that are available there in abundance, and to extend the timeline of, say, if the fish are there, you were there prime season, they're August, September, and then they show up in the winter. But what if we had a micro cannery like in the old days? They can everything in Hawaii. Micro canneries in the Northwest. So smoking, so many things that aren't being done or just starting to get done. And that's not just Kawaii, but that's another way of, okay, can't always get funded to do the science, put the satellite tags on the fish. What else can we do? I've listened to fishermen complain for 15 years that they've got nowhere to sell their fish.
Right.
What? Same as Gloucester. Same as Bluefin.
I was going to say, what you're doing in Kauai sounds just like a microcosm of a lot of places. So those lessons learned should apply elsewhere also. Those talks you talked about, are they specific to Kauai, or will they be for greater audience?
I think they'll stand for anywhere. And the expert. I was just so blown away by the expertise I managed. It just got really. I knew some of the best in the business, and then I traveled out with my goddaughter, the Fisherman, and toured some of the micro canneries and met some extraordinary people and saw this is what they do in the Northwest. If you've been out there, they can octopus, oysters, everything. They put their own labels on it, blah, blah, blah. The chefs drive down from Seattle to buy these products and boat to table. So I learned, and then we just brought it together. And now fishermen, we had them from 11 to 1 during the day. Fishermen are fishing, but they're being packaged and they'll be available on the PhD and our Ahi Hub Kauai website. And then other resources like health department rules and things for people to consider.
Oh, cool.
And then the next thing is, what are the next steps? And I've also brought the Kauai County and Economic Development to be at the table, because you need the county, you need the local, you need the approval, the permits, everything else. And so that was almost a 3-year.
Oh, wow.
That's what I did during COVID.
Because it just does seem, I think it was Paul Greenberg's book, American Seafood, left me going like, wait a second, what the heck's going on here? We need to be eating our seafood here at home. Like, how has this happened? So that's exciting to me, because that seems like the big picture goal is that we can eat. It's that it becomes easy for the consumer to buy fish from the fisheries they live in.
And the chefs that I was thinking, you're an influencer. And the other thing is the celebrities. I hate to say it, but sometimes the chefs and the purveyors are the first to be able to push the new knowledge. And I think that's hopefully what's going to happen here when you get a couple and WildFed talks about these things. I think there's just so much opportunity. And the last thing, if I could say about the bluefin guys are so, and rightly so, unhappy about all the imported bluefin that's basically flooded the market for a long time. And so there's some have talked about, well, we're going to ask our legislators to ban imported bluefin. I said, yeah, but first, before you ban it for the restaurant people, you better make sure that the restaurateurs, the chefs can get to your bluefin. Right. So you've got to do both. You can't just say, oh, no, you can't do this. You better work on your own market so that then say, sure, but here's your fish.
Yeah. Right.
Like, you have to do that.
Yeah. Oh, man. What a weird situation it is, Molly. Appreciate the work that you do on all of this and the voice that you have in it.
Well, thank you. It just, and my colleagues and collaborators. I mean, we are all on the same page. And clay tam in Hawaii,
Yeah.
it's the same everywhere. It's just how do we support our fishing communities and get better food?
Do you think you could take everything we've been talking about with this and kind of sum it up into one haiku? Like, so that a person listening gets like what, not a literal haiku.
No, it
like,
needs to be a haiku.
it must follow haiku structure. But you know what I'm saying? Like the problem and the solution we're after around this whole issue, the problem, the solution, what you're trying to accomplish with all of it.
I guess I've heard other people say, particularly in fish world, is ask where did your fish come from that you're selling me, and the other thing is get to know your fishermen.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I know that it's not always about fresh local, even though fresh locals, but it can be frozen local too, because I know Jared Auerbach, who's just said to me, I know he's an innovator, and he said frozen is the new fresh, but it still can be local.
Yeah.
But it might be the quality is better frozen first and then brought in. I don't know, but it's all about knowledge, right?
Yeah. That's it.
I'd love to talk to you again after you do your research up in Nova Scotia, you said?
We're going to Nova Scotia. Oh, and by the way, I will supply the Kawaii, the links when it goes up. We're working on the website, and I'll have links for you, because I think they're like mini fishery. I hate to use TED Talk. I think it's a cliche,
that's helpful. It's helpful because I know what you mean.
Yeah. Anyway.
Cool. Well, yeah, and we'd love to hear about what happens in Nova Scotia. And
I was going to say, if you could get up there easily.
Yeah.
Come fishing.
I would love to come fishing. Yeah, let's talk about that, and then I'll be hitting you up about Kawaii.
Oh, for sure.
For this winter too.
Oh, and you know what? We're actually bringing our highliner that we tag our ahi with. He and his son and his son's best friend. They're scheduled to fly in to be our anglers.
Oh, cool.
So they're very lucky.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it'll be the meeting of the Hawaiians with the Acadians. And
Yeah.
they're both epic, big, tall, good-looking men that are just like these giants of the fish world. They're like, they're unusual people.
Yeah.
They're physical. You saw the Hawaiians. They're very large.
Yeah.
And like Samoans, but but our Hawaiian captain is also a very tall man and very Hawaiian Portuguese, and his son. So they stand out, and they basically pick up the fish. He puts it on the deck, and most people couldn't
move
the rest of us mortals, mere mortals, but to put them two together will be
that's cool.
a lot of fishing, and the two cultures will be very interesting. That's why it's almost a shame. It could be a reality show.
Yeah, maybe it should be.
Yeah.
Well, let's have a little discussion about that right after. Molly, great to have you here again today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.